Hello, and welcome to tonight's Empower Hour, sponsored by Empower Our Future. It's great to have you joining us this evening. We encourage you to mark your calendar for next week, Wednesday, June 26th, when the Colorado Energy Office will publish a draft microgrid roadmap online. And then that day, Wednesday, the 26th at 2, they're going to host a webinar where they will provide an overview of this roadmap. Please note the URL on the slide, energyoffice.colorado.gov/microgrid-roadmap, because there you'll find a link to register for that overview, as well as information and links for stakeholder engagement and public comment. According to their website, the Colorado Microgrid Roadmap will evaluate the role of microgrids in ensuring all Coloradans have access to reliable and resilient electrical service, and to provide guidance on how microgrids can improve grid resilience and reliability, deliver and manage electricity, provide necessary infrastructure in locations where extending distribution infrastructure is not practical, and operate independently and disconnected from the larger grid when necessary to meet the electricity needs of communities, neighborhoods, or buildings. Public comment on the project is this summer, and the state will publish the final microgrid roadmap no later than January 1st of 2025. Because we feel this is a really important topic, we've scheduled an Empower Hour in July on Tuesday, July 16th, with Peter Lilienthal, PhD, to fill us in. On the 16th, he will provide an independent, informed review of the CEO microgrid roadmap so that those who are interested can participate in the comment period. We'll have the registration for that Empower Hour available soon. And now, as we always do, I will just read the land acknowledgement. We acknowledge with respect as non-native people that the land on which we stand, live, and learn is the traditional territory of the Ute, Cheyenne, and Arapaho peoples. We also recognize the 48 contemporary tribal nations that are historically tied to the lands that make up the state of Colorado. We honor elders past, present, and future, and those who have stewarded this land throughout generations. We also recognize that our government, academic, and cultural institutions and our nation itself were founded upon and continue to enact exclusions and erasures of Indigenous peoples. May this acknowledgement demonstrate a commitment to working to dismantle ongoing legacies of settler colonialism, oppression, and inequities, and to recognize the hundreds of Indigenous nations who continue to resist, live, create, and uphold their sacred relations across their lands. Let us seek to understand what it means to be in right relationship today with the traditional stewards of this land and with this land itself and all the creatures that inhabit it. All right, just a couple of things before we get started. The chat will not be open, but we will have a Q&A open. That'll be how you can ask questions. Also, we want you to know that this Empower Hour is being recorded, and the video will be available on our website later this week at empowerourfuture.org on the events page, and it'll be included in an email later this week as well. Happily, our speaker has generously agreed to stay past 7 if there are folks still on the Zoom with questions. So we'll make a note at the top of the hour and then continue with Q&A. And finally, it is my pleasure to introduce our guest this evening, Dr. Ron Sinton. He is a Coloradan who got his PhD working on high-efficiency silicon solar cells at Stanford, and then became a founding member of the PV company SunPower. Ron then founded Sinton Instruments in 1992, which manufactures electronic equipment in Boulder, Colorado for the entire international solar cell manufacturing industry. In recent years, Ron has also worked in modeling 100% renewable systems and has testified as an expert witness for environmental groups at the Colorado PUC advocating for low-cost clean energy. Welcome, Ron, and thank you for being our guest tonight.
Thank you, Mary. It's my pleasure to be here. Okay, there it is. Okay, so first I'm going to give you an update on Xcel's progress on cleaning up the grid. And the short version is daytime is now cleaner than night. And then I want to hit on 3 points that I've been focused on in recent years that I think we have good updates on. The first is that with today's grid, you can choose to use mostly clean energy. The second point will be designing a reliable, low-cost, clean grid. And optimizing renewables for difficult seasons is not a bad thing. It can be lowest cost. And then the last point that I'd like to make is that cost matters. Solar can clean up our energy supply if we install low-cost solar. And I want to talk a little bit about rooftop and community solar cost and price. The first thing I'll show is in the top plot here. And this is the progress in renewables and relative to fossil fuels on Xcel's balancing area. And I'm showing generation in megawatts on the vertical axis, and then years from 2019 through 2024, the present, on the horizontal axis. And we can see that renewables has been climbing during these 5.5 years. And this spring, renewables are decisively higher than fossil fuel. And I think this will be the first year when we have a majority renewable grid. This year to date, it's at about 53% renewable. And I estimate that for a family of 4, you have 6.4 kilowatts of renewable clean energy capacity on the grid available at the wall outlet. And if we break the renewables into wind in blue and PV in red, we can see that the remarkable thing that's happened in the last year is that last June, we installed about 1 gigawatt of utility solar. And so we have a lot of solar on the grid. This has had a major effect on the power supply in Colorado, and I'll show this in the next few slides. I'd like to show a color-coded map for 8760 hours per year. This is all the hours in a year. And I'm going to code fossil fuel as black as coal, and renewable energy as this bright green, 100% renewable energy. And when I show color maps of this here, I'm showing from December 31st at midnight through January 1st, morning, noon, afternoon, and night. And then the 365 days go across to give us the entire year. So we can see that noon is right down the center here. And we can see dawn and dusk, and there's just a hint of PV here greening up the center of the day. And this was in 2022. Now, if we look at the last 365 days, we see that it's changed quite a bit. Daytime is much brighter, which means it's much cleaner. you can clearly see dawn and dusk. You can see that while daytimes are generally clean, night can be very dirty. This is almost 100% fossil fuel for 4 nights in a row, or very clean. It depends whether the wind's blowing. It's kind of easier to look at this in the average. And so here I'm giving the annual average of fossil fuel from 0 to 100% of the grid versus hour of the day. And we can see that in 2022, there was a hint of PV during daytime. In 2023, we had about half a year of the new solar. And this is our first full year of having the new solar on the grid. And the result is that daytime is about 33% cleaner than night on average over the year. Another way to look at this is to consider which hours actually have excess renewables. When we have more renewables than we can really use on the grid. And so what I'm showing here is the number of hours with excess renewables out of a possible 365 versus hour of the day. And what we can see is that during the daytime hours from 8 till 4, about 50% of the time we have excess renewables, as opposed to night when it's about 25 to 30%. So daytime hours have excess renewables more than half the time. It's interesting to look at this in detail because I think it's better when you really understand what's going on. And so here I'm showing percent renewables of generation. And of course, higher is better on this axis. This would be 100% renewables. And you can see that for 10 days in April, I've plotted it here, and you have a dirty night followed by a clean day, a dirty night, a clean day, a very dirty night. Then within just a few hours, you bounce up to 75% renewables. And so this is a really difficult grid to deal with, and it's unique to Colorado because we don't have nuclear and we don't have much hydro. And so we're really dependent on wind and solar as renewables. Up here at the top, I'm just coding the hours where we have excess renewables in red. So this shows when we have excess renewables. Now in the next graph, I'm going to show this for every hour in the year so far. And the reason I'm showing this is because you can see that in January and February, we didn't have excess renewables very often. But then through the spring, we have them almost every day. And this is up to the present. And what this variability in going from a fossil fuel grid to renewable grid means is that you really can choose to use renewable energy at this point. And so for the year to date, I've actually done the math. And I find that if you, for example, charge your car at night, you'll be using about 42% renewable power. If instead you charge your car during daytime, you'll be using close to 60% renewable power. And this is with no technology because you definitely know when it's night and when it's day without being told. However, if you had technology that told you when you had excess renewables, you could charge your car on 100% renewable power, which would be amazing. And this is shown here. Clearly, there's another option, and that's to charge during daytime and just don't charge on rainy days, and you'd be somewhere between 60 and 100% renewable. Now, we've had some late-breaking developments on this, and the ball is really in our court now. Boulder and Excel have an agreement just at the end of May to design a plan for making renewable day-ahead and week-ahead predictions publicly available so that we'll know in advance when the clean energy will be available on the grid. And this should enable better planning and the use of clean energy. In addition to this, the PUC commissioners have verbally ordered the PUC to write up an order to make renewables and wholesale week ahead price data publicly available. So this really enables us to do more with demand shifting to use clean energy. I would note, though, that Xcel is on the record testifying that they don't believe customers will respond to this information in any significant way. So we really need to prove Xcel is wrong in order to accelerate the clean energy shift. And because if we can shift to clean energy, more will be installed. For example, if we shift some of our demand into daytime, the only reasonable power to install is PV. So this brings me to the next topic, which is designing a reliable renewable grid. And the question here is, how much renewables should we install? Enough to make a reliable low-cost grid, or is there some other limit that makes sense? And to talk about this, I need to give you a definition of curtailment of renewables. And according to the CPUC, curtailments are undelivered renewable energy. This is actually when we have more renewable energy than the demand can actually use at any point in time. And the reason I want to talk about this is the word curtailment was used 53 times in the PUC resource plan decision, which was to install 670 megawatts of gas, 1,700 of PV, 1,700 wind, and 1,800 of battery storage. Curtailment was a big issue in this proceeding. Now, the discussion of curtailment in regulatory proceedings really caught my eye. And these were some of the comments that were in testimony. Curtailment of renewable energy is a problem because it wastes clean energy and reduces the benefits of renewable energy projects. It also undermines public support for clean energy. Staff can find no evidence that it costs the company anything when it curtails the delivery of renewable energy, and curtailment is a black eye on renewables. Certainly a very negative perspective on this, but the bottom line that this led to in testimony was a more acceptable level for curtailments is 5%. So this is a proposal to cap curtailments on renewable energy as a goal. Now, in another proceeding, the Xcel was required to actually give projections for their resource plan. And so I'd like to show you some of this in the bottom left corner. And this is curtailment by the hour of the day in megawatts. And we can see that we have significant curtailment now during daytime, peaking around noon. But if you look out to 2027, we have huge curtailment, more than a gigawatt during daytime hours, from basically 7 till 4 in the afternoon. Now keep this in mind as we go through the rest of this presentation, that we have excess renewables during daytime hours. Now, why this matters is that in the transportation electrification plan, for example, Public Service Company of Colorado proposed an EV charging plan. And this was to offer very low electricity rates at night for EV charging. So try and move the EV charging into the night, despite the fact that we have excess renewables during daytime. And this was rejected in the regulatory proceeding, largely on the arguments that I showed in the previous page, that we really should be using the excess renewable energy to charge EVs and encourage people to do that, as well as arguments by several parties that emission intensity is the highest at night and the lowest during the daytime. And it's true that curtailment does increase the cost per kilowatt hour of power delivered to load. And this is shown here. I'm showing the cost per kilowatt hour actually delivered to customers versus the percentage of renewables curtailed. And we can see that at 20% curtailment, you might think that the cost would go up just 20%, but it goes up 58%, because in addition to not using 20% of the power, you actually have to compensate the company that Xcel buys wind power from with the production tax credits that they don't receive from the federal government. So it is more expensive to curtail power. However, is this really waste? Does it indicate negligence or inefficiencies? If it's unnecessary or could be avoided by demand flexibility, as we showed in the previous slide, then yes, but resource planners may see curtailment somewhat differently. And this is what I want to talk about in the next few slides. It's a subtle but important topic. And the reason is that curtailments trade off with expensive batteries in highly renewable systems. And this is shown in this figure from a recent journal article down here. And what it's showing is the price of electricity, price of power on this left axis versus the percentage of curtailment here. And if you install the minimum of PV that you need to meet annual energy demands, shown in yellow here, and you use storage to distribute it to the hours of the days and year when it's needed, the hours of the various seasons, then you end up with a huge cost in the battery. If instead, and this is for the case of zero curtailment, you just put in the amount of PV you need plus a lot of storage. If instead you put in more PV, such that you're basically planning for the most difficult seasons, for winter and the summer peak, and then what you find is that you need so many fewer batteries that the cost of the system comes way down, about a factor of 5 down. Now, I learned this effect in kind of a backward way, in that nuclear advocacy groups actually define 100% renewables to be this scenario, where you have PV plus batteries at zero curtailment. And they do this in order to exaggerate the cost of renewables, make it 5 times higher than it really is, in order to make nuclear look better. But in fact, this is exactly how we design a fossil fuel system, to look for the minimum and to design the generation to actually meet the most difficult peak demand days rather than the easiest ones. And Paul Denholm at NREL, in his great talk, The Last 10% to 100% Renewable, says that a third of the fossil fuel power plant fleet provides 2% of the total annual energy. And what this means is that 98% of the time, a third of the fossil power plant fleet is basically curtailed. We just don't call it that. So this optimization, where you build a little more PV than you absolutely need in order to find the lowest cost system, is absolutely normal. It's the same as we've always done. Now, if you plug in numbers from Colorado, and going back to this plot, you can see how this is true. And once again, this is the cost per kilowatt delivered. And at 0% curtailment for PV, it's about 2.8 cents. And if you curtail 20% of the PV, the cost per kilowatt hour delivered is only 20% higher in this case, which is still really low cost electricity that you can use to displace fossil fuel. If, on the other hand, you decided at 5% curtailment that you needed to add batteries and put the extra power into batteries before putting it on the grid, you go up to a cost of 13.5 cents per kilowatt hour. This is what it cost to generate PV, put it in a battery, and then put it on the grid later. So you can see that there's a lot of, that you can add a lot of PV and renewables in general to the grid with this curtailment strategy at very low price, displacing fossil fuel. Now I wanted to show you how this works in practice here with real data from the Energy Information Agency for the XL balancing area. And this is megawatts versus hours over the course of 6 days. And this is the load here in brown. And in blue, I'm showing renewables and exports. So this is renewables that are supplying the load. And what I want you to notice is that these renewables are following the load exactly. They're actually increasing when the load increases, decreasing when the load decreases. And you might think this isn't possible because you can't tell the wind to blow harder when demand increases for electricity. But in fact, you can do this if you have excess renewables at that point of time and you're exporting some of them and you're curtailing some of them. Then when you have a need for extra power on the grid, you just export or curtail less of them. When you have less demand on the grid, you export and curtail more of them. So over the course of most of these hours and 6 days, we basically have dispatchable renewable resources. And this is kind of magic. Most people may not realize that this is possible because you can predict when these renewables will be available. The coal was basically off during this period. It was at a minimum run level, and the gas was at a fairly low level, only responding for a few hours when it needed to be. Up here, I again showed the hours that had excess renewables, which made this whole thing possible, that you have dispatchable renewables. Now, in the next graph, it's exactly the same graph, but I'm going to show 21 days. And these first 6 days are the ones that I just showed you. And then the wind kind of drops off and gas has to take over for a few days. And then we have a few days where gas has to kick in at night. And then we're back to dispatchable renewables for another 6 days. And this is in the spring, May, when we have a lot of renewables. But as we increase renewables, as time goes on, we're going to see a lot more days like this, with the gas just standing back in reserve, and a lot fewer days like this, extending over much more of the year. 2 more points on this before I go on to the third topic. And this is the seasonality of excess renewables, or these curtailments. And this shows the curtailments versus month of the year. And you can notice that the curtailments peak in the spring, and then summer you don't have many because the renewables go into the air conditioning peak that we all have, and then it picks up again in the fall. And I was just wondering what kind of load you might use to use these excess renewables. And I took my heating bill and noticed that most of these curtailments are during heating season. So it's pretty easy to see that you could use excess renewable energy, which is extremely low cost, to help displace gas heating in the wintertime. Now, the third topic that I'm going to talk about here is the cost of PV. And this is very close to my heart because this is what I've worked on technically for more than 40 years. Clearly, PV has the potential to help cost effectively transition the grid to clean energy because it is very low cost. PV module costs have declined by 50x in the last 15 years. And I'm showing this in this graph, which is a log scale here. You can see it dropping by a factor of 50 from 2008 till the present. Now, what I've noticed is that not all PV being installed in Colorado is actually low cost. I'll show the general trend in PV cost here. And this is from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. And it shows the utility PV cost in dollars per megawatt hour coming down in time from 2009 till 2021. Now, when Xcel does a resource plan, they do an open source competitive bid, and the prices come in right along the lines of these prices, about 2.8 cents per kilowatt hour. However, we have two other kinds of solar electricity. One is community solar, and I show that up here at about 8 cents a kilowatt hour, and net metered solar at about 11.2 cents a kilowatt hour. So I'll talk here in the next few slides about the special case of net metered rooftop solar. Now, I wrote a small novel here, but I'm not going to read it. Instead, I'm going to take the graph from the Solar Energy Industries Association and just take the amount of residential solar that's been installed for the last 10 years, shown here in dark blue. And I'm going to calculate what it costs when Xcel buys this power from people's rooftops. And they buy it at $112 a megawatt hour. And this is in contrast to the price of utility solar, which is $48 per megawatt hour, including the transmission. Rooftop arrays last about 20 years. The PV production is about 1,600 kilowatt hours per kilowatt peak. So it's as if your array runs 1,600 hours a year. And self-consumption is 30%, which means 70% goes to the grid. When you calculate this for the entire state, you find that this is the extra cost of buying rooftop solar instead of buying utilities solar, even when you include the transmission into the cost of the utility solar. And 10 years ago, when there wasn't much solar and we were trying to prime the pump of the industry to get it going, this was a very low cost. But as time goes on, we're up to about $55 million a year in extra cost. If you assume that this continues for the 20-year life of these panels, then this is the kind of commitment we are making in extra cost for rooftop solar. It's up to about $1 billion, and it's climbing about $260 million a year. Now, there's always the argument that solar is worth much more than utility solar, that rooftop solar is worth much more than utility solar. And this argument was made. I'm going to show an example from testimony of Carl Rabago at the Austin Energy. And what it's showing is that there are a lot of other attributes of rooftop PV that need to be taken into account. You can't read this, so I put new labels on. And basically, it's the health benefits of clean energy, the social cost of carbon, transmission and distribution, and the cost of gas and coal plants that you're displacing. But in Colorado, we have a lot of solar now, and rooftop solar only competes with utility solar. And so basically, You don't have the health benefits because utility solar also has that. You don't have the social cost of carbon benefits. You just have these two. And so that's the price of utility solar plus the transmission cost at 2 cents a kilowatt hour. Now, I want to show you why some of these other things can be neglected, and it's because things have changed over time. And what this is the 1,000 hours of peak fossil fuel dispatch. These are the expensive hours to serve on Xcel's grid. And this is from the rate case proceeding, where for each hour of the day, you're showing how many of the peak hours during the year occurred then. And so these are the most expensive hours to serve on the grid. What we notice is that daytime has none of these hours. And this is the tremendous success of PV. We've eliminated daytime as a time when we have to use fossil fuel peakers. But on the other hand, it means that rooftop PV is that a house with rooftop PV and net metering is using power at exactly the most expensive times of the day. And so that's one point that's changed over the years to change the way that we have to think about these things. Another point is the cost of CO2 reduction for the different flavors of PV. This is for when you install PV, how much fossil fuel does it displace in terms of dollar per ton of carbon dioxide reduction versus the renewable curtailment. And utility PV is about 5 to 7 times more cost effective than rooftop PV, and about 3 to 4 times more effective than community PV. And this is just due to the cost of rooftop and community PV. So I'm not saying that I don't believe that we should be installing a lot of rooftop and community PV. It's just that we should pay more attention to the price. And I'm going to note that the Coalition for Community Solar Access sponsored a study, Local Solar for All Costs Less. The Nature Conservancy have a study, Power of Place. The Colorado Energy Office have a study. And in each case, they come out with about $1 per watt, which would put the cost down here. This is where the costs actually are. When we designed the net metering program, it was in 2004, and the cost of installing solar was much higher than the retail price. Now the opposite is true. And it's kind of bizarre that we choose to fix the price of solar to be very high when the cost has been coming down. I was just at a conference last week, the IEEE PVSC, and talking to all my colleagues from the entire world. And I find that rooftop solar in Australia, Germany, Poland, Spain, everywhere cost about 0.9 to $1.50 a watt, whereas in Boulder, we pay about $4 a watt. So this is, the cost problem is unique to the United States, and it's very solvable. So that brings me to the conclusions. I wanted to make the point that great progress is being made at reducing CO2. I see ways that it could be made even faster if we used flexible demand, and it's go time on this with the demand shifting, because we're going to have all the tools that we need to do this. We just have to prove that we're willing. I made the point that the lowest cost may be attained with significant renewable curtailment. Curtailment is not necessarily a bad thing. But once you do have curtailment, this further opens up the opportunity to use the low-cost electricity for beneficial electrification. And the last point that I made, I expect to be somewhat controversial, is that some of the PV we are installing is mandated by arcane laws to be unnecessarily very high cost. And this is actually limiting the role to a fast transition to low cost clean energy. So thank you very much. And we can take questions now.
Hi, Ron. This is Chris Hoffman with Empower Our Future. And we're starting to get some questions here. First one is, the problem is that Excel charges less at night and the highest charge is 3 to 7 in the afternoon. Could you respond to that one?
Yes, I can. So there was a rate case that went through very recently, and I testified on behalf of WRA on that one. And the commissioners came out with their ruling in February that the time of use rates need to be changed to align with daytime hours. So they assigned a schedule to this, and a process is supposed to start in September in order to be ready for next summer. So this is in the works, and I have good optimism for it, but I think there's some work involved to make sure that the design is a little better this time, is a lot better this time. The commissioners definitely are on board with this.
Thank you. You said that there's a cost problem for rooftop PV and it could be solved. How would you recommend solving that cost problem?
So, of course, I'm not an installer, but I can speculate. And I think that what we've done is we've put a lot of emphasis on the subsidy side. And so we've created an industry that's optimized for installing as much solar as possible at the $4 watt kind of range.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, they break even or make a profit at retail rates. But the cost of solar has actually dropped to about a quarter of that. And so we should change the incentives in the subsidies so that it incentivizes low cost installations. And, I have some ideas on this. One aspect is that the investment tax credit, the 30% tax credit, is on the price. And so in a way that incentivizes high prices because you get a bigger check from the federal government if you spent more on the system. So that's not a great idea. Other ways would be to streamline the permitting, which is a major cost. And this has been addressed by NREL with a application to do the permitting faster, and it's called Solar App. So we need to get our cities to sign up for the Solar App, which is a very streamlined permitting system. And there are other ways, but I think that a big amount of the reason that we pay a lot for solar is that we incentivize. We have perverse incentives to do exactly that.
And thank you. And that may relate to another question I see in the queue, which is, what is it that makes PV so much more expensive in the US? Is it because the permitting is, the incentives are on different, not on the price, or because the permitting is streamlined, or what?
So a lot of it is essentially the permitting, is the building codes, and the fact that every locality has their own building codes in the US, as opposed to, the European Union or Australia, where there's more common building codes across political boundaries. So that's a big part of it. Right now, the US has very high tariffs on solar modules.
Mhm.
So while the market price internationally for solar module is 10 cents a watt, which is just amazing. For a kilowatt, that's $100. In the US, it's about 34 cents a watt.
Mhm.
It's 3 times higher.
Wow. So how will a consumer or business use the predictive information that Excel is now required to provide for solar or wind?
So there are many ways to do that. If you are industrial or even commercial, you might have an energy manager for your company. And so depending how they do this, and this will be negotiated between Boulder and Excel and others, I presume, you can download this data and then run your building or your industrial operations to use the lowest cost power. In the long term, you want Excel to actually charge you power according to what it cost, so that you can save money by using renewable power. In the short term, I think that you'll just want to be motivated by using renewables. Excel does have a program for EV charging that charges your EV when the price is the lowest, and then gives you a rebate, which the commissioners specified should be $150 a year if you sign up for this program. So there's a variety of ways.
And Will, you talked about a business having some kind of energy manager, but what about the average homeowner or EV owner? How would they access this? How would they use it?
I really want to emphasize that the low-tech solutions,
Mhm.
that on average, just using power during daytime is much cleaner. And so I think that's something everyone can do. You'll be able to sign up for an aggregator eventually that will sign up, 1,000 households, 10,000 households, and run them as if they're a virtual power plant.
Mhm.
But of course, they'll take a cut. So you have to decide where you want to be on this spectrum. But I think the individuals can take advantage of this themselves, or if they want to sign up for a program, they can give over the control of some of their devices, maybe EV chargers and water heaters, over to an organization that will run it professionally using the internet, most likely.
Are there EV chargers on the market or soon to be on the market that could take the information from Excel and just automatically know when to charge your car?
Yes. And the Excel Charging Perks program actually uses the smarts within your car itself. And so it controls the car wirelessly
Uh-huh.
to charge when the price is low.
Okay. And do all EVs have that or just more recent ones?
I believe that Excel is also contracting with someone that puts something you can plug into your car to give it this capability. But in their pilot program, they went with 4 or 5 brands that had this capability already. We'll see where it goes.
Okay.
They're expanding the program to all EVs. It's no longer a pilot program.
And it's called Charging Perks?
Charging Perks, yes.
Great. Thank you. Another question in the queue is, why is the high cost mandated? What does the old law say?
It says that it's net metering law.
Mhm.
And what it says is that more or less, Excel pays you the retail price for electricity for each kilowatt hour that you put on the grid. And so when you use it later, it nets out to zero cost. And so what that does is essentially fixes the price that Excel pays, which is covered by ratepayers, to be the retail price.
Mhm.
The wholesale price of electricity is usually between 2 and 4 cents a kilowatt hour, but the retail price is around 11, 12, 13 now.
Mhm.
And so that's the difference.
That's the difference, is pegging it to the retail price.
That's right.
Yeah.
And it made a lot of sense
Mhm.
in 2004, because that price was not enough to cover the price of your solar system. So the person, it would help cover the price, but the person installing solar wouldn't actually make money at that rate.
Mm. Another question in the queue. It seems that Excel is not passing on the low costs of solar and wind and storage. So what can we do about that?
I believe they are passing it on, because the cost of a PPA goes right into the fuel cost adjustment. And so if Excel is paying 2.8 cents a kilowatt hour for a PPA from a solar power plant, that's what is covered by customers. So it's treated more or less like a fuel cost
Mhm.
from a conventional power plant.
Thank you. Another question. Would it be more useful for Excel to provide actual information on how clean the energy is every minute of the day, so software can automatically help consumers shift their loads when electricity is clean and abundant?
Yes, the answer is yes.
Okay. Okay. Here's another one. Sorry I was late, but saw that part of your closing comments were that we are paying inflated prices for electricity. Could you comment on why these prices are inflated? And would you have any suggestions on how to bring those costs down for the consumer?
Yes, what I was talking about is that we're paying more than we should be for rooftop solar and for community solar. And this is legislatively mandated. And in my opinion, we need an off-ramp
Mhm.
down to market prices on these things.
So if I can, what I'm hearing you saying that these price settings made sense when the solar was more in its infancy, but now we've kind of outgrown them, and it's time to kind of rethink the incentives.
Yeah, that's right. And it's very location specific.
Mm.
And so this gets very confusing, because in most states in the United States, there is very little solar. And so daytime has very expensive electricity. And so solar has a high value. And in those states, net metering can be a really good way to prime the pump. In Colorado now, in the XL area territory, we have about 15% solar. And so the value of the next bit of solar at noon is very low. And so that's changed the whole picture. And so when you read various articles on net metering, they're often referring to states where it's still a good idea, but you want to look at Colorado specifically, where we are today, as opposed to where we were 5 years ago.
So it's not one size fits all states.
Not at all.
Okay.
There's a National Academy of Sciences study on this, and they recommended that everyone look at this and basically plan for the future, because we are going to go solar in the future, probably in all 50 states. And so the issues that are cropping up in the leading states, California, Arizona, Nevada, Hawaii, Colorado now, it's going to come everywhere, but it's not hitting them in the face quite as much as it is here.
Great, thank you. Next question. How can we start using more solar during the day now without being penalized? Do we need to wait until September to be considered for the Boulder Excel agreement for May 20 to avoid paying more during the day?
No. Right now, you start paying more at 1 p.m. and it's a shoulder rate, so it's not a lot more. And so what I would recommend is that you use 8 to 1 p.m. And there's no penalty for that. That's at the lowest rate.
8 to 1 p.m.
Right.
And Empower Our Future has been promoting the slogan, plug into the sun. It sounds like that would fit with it.
Right. I can go farther. All weekends and holidays are at the low rate also. So it's a large fraction of the hours in the year are at the lowest rate during daytime.
Okay, so plug into the sun, 8 to 1, plus
8
weekends.
to 1 and weekends, yeah.
Yeah, and 1 rhymes with sun, so that's great. Next question. Let's see. When comparing the cost of rooftop solar with utility solar, how do you factor in the cost of installation for rooftop PV, which is paid by each consumer and so is not added to the rate base, compared to the cost of utility solar, which goes into the rate base?
Okay. So that's a good point. And so how I would answer this, most utility solar doesn't go into the rate base. Right now, there is very little utility solar that's in the rate base because it's been purchased as a power purchase agreement from an independent power producer. And so it's treated as a fuel cost. The calculations that I did are basically the cost to ratepayers for buying PV from the homeowner. The homeowner did incur the cost of putting the PV on the roof, and were essentially promised that it would pay back through the rates that they would, through the amount of electricity that they're able to sell Xcel. So the homeowner does have an incentive to try and find the lowest bid from a reputable solar installer to try and minimize that cost.
Great, thanks. And we have a question from Alan Best of Big Pivots. Where do you see the most interesting work in demand management occurring, whether in Colorado or elsewhere?
So Xcel has been a laggard in demand flexibility, I would say. Mm-hmm. They've been pretty good at demand management in the sense of controlling air conditioners in summer, just the summer peak only. The places that are really ahead of the curve are Europe, the UK, Denmark. Most of Europe has dynamic pricing now, and Australia, especially South Australia. They're doing much better than we are in that front. California is working very hard on it right now, but they seem to be in the early stages. And given that they've had the duck curve for 10 years, I think it's more of an example of what we don't want to do.
Mhm.
To wait too long until you actually have a big problem.
Yeah, thank you. I see we're just about at time. I want to thank you again for being willing to stay past time. We call this an Empower Hour, so we're going to just call the time now. I don't know if Mary has anything to add before we transition to Empower Hour after hours, but just on behalf of everybody here online and from Empower Our Future, I just want to thank you so much for being with us. And we'll just continue with Steve Whitaker handling the questions. We've got a lot more in the queue. And Mary, do you have some announcements as we wrap up?
Yes, thanks, Chris. Thank you, Ron. Really interesting. We appreciate your being here. And I want to be sure to thank the other Empower Our Future team members who are integral to making Empower Hours happen. They are Paul Cullen, Chris Hoffman, Steve Whitaker, and Julie Zonizer. We have several other interesting Empower Hours in the works, so please be sure you're on our mailing list. Sign up at our website, empowerourfuture.org. And again, you'll be able to find this Empower Hour recording and all of our previous Empower Hour recordings on the events page. Hope to see you in July.
Great, I'll pick it up from here with the Empower Hour after hour, and we'll continue with our questions. And thank you, Chris, for moderating to this point. So one of the questions that came in through chat is the cost of curtailing wind more or less than the cost of curtailing solar?
So the cost of curtailing wind in the past, so for all existing installations, is much higher. And it's due to the way that the federal government is subsidizing it. It's with a production tax credit. Traditionally, solar has been an investment tax credit, which is just a rebate on the purchase price. And so in the past, solar would be curtailed first because it's cheaper to curtail it, and wind would be curtailed last. In the IRA, this changed, and solar can also get a production tax credit. So honestly, I don't know. It depends on how the power purchase agreements are written. But I believe that some of the solar will be using the production tax credit in the future. And the negotiations will determine how this goes.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Sorry if this was addressed and I missed it. Why is Excel charging less and promoting use during the night when there is so much excess renewable energy during the day?
This is basically inertia, I think. Regulatory bodies have always wanted to use data, not speculation, and so you use historical data. And the grid was cheaper at night not too many years ago, like last year. It's only with all of the solar that just came on that it flipped. And so we'll have to see. We need to have Excel look into the future. When they knew that solar was coming online, but they kept planning for basically the cost structure of a fossil fuel grid because that's what their history was. And so both the regulators, the interveners, Sierra Club, and Excel have to look into the future. If you've already planned to install this much solar and this much wind, you should anticipate what it's going to do to the curtailment and the prices, and plan for that, because it takes years to get these plans going for demand flexibility.
So if you were to adjust the rate structure that we're currently dealing with, how much would you shift it in time
for me, what I think we should do and what I will be arguing for is to have low rates during daytime, probably from 8 to 2 in summer or 8 till 4 in the other 10 months of the year, or the other 8 months of the year. And then a quite high rate from 6 till 9. And this is what the commissioners specifically ask for, because this is when you have to use gas peakers in the past. And then a moderate rate through the night until the low rate in the morning. That's what would align best with renewables. And what it is, technically it's pricing determined by the net demand, by the load minus renewables. The need to dispatch fossil fuels used to depend on the load, but now the renewable availability is more variable than the load used to change. And so it's determined more by the renewable availability than it is the traditional load curve. And the combination of the two is called net demand, and that's what should determine the price.
Okay, thank you. Next question. On one of your slides that incorporated batteries, I think it mentioned backup for 4 hours. I think I've heard that number before, but how much of a cost adder can Piesco legitimately claim for providing reliability for dark calms that occasionally can last considerably longer?
That's a good question. Right now, you would not use lithium-ion batteries for a dark calm. It would be too expensive. Typically, lithium-ion batteries are very good for 2 hours to 4 hours, which happens to be what a combustion turbine does for a summer air conditioning peak. So they're very good for that application. But for 4 days, that would require 20 times more batteries, and it would be 20 times more expensive. So batteries are not ready for a dark calm yet. And so I guess the way the question was asked, the premium is very high to cover the 4-day dark calm.
And what does cover the 4-day dark calm?
Well, right now, it's gas and coal. In 2031, it will be mostly gas. And in the future, and we're only talking a few percent of the time. And so it's not a huge problem with respect to emissions. It is a cost issue to eliminate that last 5% of fossil fuel because of these 4-day dark calms.
Okay. And the next question. Utility scale solar and wind don't factor in power outages, which actually have very high costs for businesses and individuals. Distributed solar and storage can reduce or eliminate the cost of power outages. How do you think we should factor in the cost of power outages and the cost of connecting to utility scale wind and solar farms?
Okay. So the way that companies deal with power outages now, if you have critical processes, is to have backup generators. And you can do that with batteries. But right now it's pretty expensive. And so it's just a it's a cost issue. How much you want to use batteries for this function. It will be more expensive than using the grid right now. And as the questioner points out, power outages can be very expensive for an industrial operation, but also for homes that have medical issues. And so it's kind of case by case. If you're one of those cases, then you have a backup generator, and you should price a solar plus storage system as well and see if it's competitive, or if you want to do the cleaner option, just go with it, whether it's competitive or not. But the grid is cheaper. And so if you want affordable power for everyone, the grid is a big component to doing that.
Okay. If wind and solar are generally cheaper than fossil fuels, why do our rates keep going up?
So, I mean, that's a complicated question, but part of my talk addressed part of that, and that solar is not necessarily cheaper. Utility solar is cheaper. Rooftop and community solar actually raise rates, and so they're contributing to increase the rates. We've also had high gas prices in the 1 year of 2022, which spiked our rates. And when you get to very high percentage of renewables, you'll also have some price increases, trying to balance the grid, trying to deal with those 4-day dark calms. We're not anywhere near there yet. I can't explain all the rate increases. It's a complicated thing.
Okay. Next question is, you said that Excel was predicting that the May 20 pilot would fail, i.e. that people would not change their behavior. But how are they publicizing this so people even know they can make a statement with their usage?
So it's not just Excel. There's a lot of skepticism everywhere that people will change their behavior to use clean energy. And they clearly have not advertised this yet. I wonder, I think we have to take a big role in mobilizing, clean energy advocates and environmentalists and make them aware. I need to point out that a good fraction of all states in the United States have this information already. They have the day ahead, week ahead predictions of renewables. And there's not a lot of voluntary shift. And so Excel is not necessarily wrong on this. I think what's changed so much is the simplicity of the message that our power comes from the sunshine, and so it's obviously cheaper whenever the sun's up. The message with wind is more difficult, and that's where we need the prediction. But we really have to see if people will shift. It's an open question. It certainly would help if Excel would publicize it you know, in all of their mailers and otherwise. And I don't see why they wouldn't, because it should be a great public relations thing to go fast with clean energy.
Great. Well, we have no further questions. I don't know if there's anything further that you wanted to say in wrapping up. But in any case, we certainly do appreciate your time that's gone into both the research to develop this concepts and also your willingness to share it with us in a way that's consumable. So that's been great to have you for this Empower Hour. And if you have anything further you want to add to the remarks you've already made, please feel free.
Yeah, I would add something, and that's that I really enjoy talking to people about these issues, and I would encourage anyone that has questions or comments or corrections to just contact me. And my email is easy to find on Google, but it's ron@sintoninstruments.com. And please contact me.
Very generous, Ron. Thank you. Thank you for all the attendees, and thank you, Ron, and much appreciated. And we'll say good night.
Good night. Thanks.